When she first flew in the 1950s, claiming fame as the world's first operational supersonic military aircraft, her polished silver body seemed to echo the chrome-lined, soaring optimism of a decade when everything seemed possible. Then they went and covered her with that drab camouflage of the 60s for service in Vietnam, and with that saw the slow replacement of hope with something much bleaker. If there was ever a bellwether aircraft that could sum up a large part of America's post-war journey, then the F-100 would be a prime candidate. Hello, welcome to Aviation Republic. Thank you for joining me today. In this episode, I want to dig into the story of the North American F-100 Super Sabre. But before we start, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who contributed their fantastic photos and videos to this project. You guys are the best. Credits at the end, so let's crack on. Although the F-100 never came near to its predecessor, the F-86 Sabre, in variants or numbers built, she did have a very long and active life, with the last of the type being struck off in the early 80s by the Turkish Air Force, the F-100's sole remaining operator. The F-100 was also the first of the Century series of aircraft, a series of advanced supersonic post-war designs that were given numerical designations that ran from the F-100 all the way through to the F-106 Delta Dart. The F-100 was the most produced of all of them, with 2,294 rolling off the production line. To an entire generation of military aviators and enthusiasts, the Hun, the name coined from its numerical designation, is remembered with respect and a degree of affection. However, some pilots who flew it may have described it less favorably. This affection came even though, as a type, the F-100 had to overcome huge problems. Always suffered an accident rate higher than the average, and had handling characteristics described as a controlled crash by a pilot with 2,000 hours on the type. Although she did possess some excellent features, such as honest flight characteristics, a robust airframe, reliable systems, and a sense of fitness for purpose that extended from its sharp-lipped, gaping mouth to its variable afterburner nozzle. Personally, the F-100 has always struck me as the in-between machine, the first step on the road towards some outstanding aircraft. If the F-100 were a dog, she'd be a pit bull. Strong, muscular, stout, smart, and dependable. However, in the wrong hands, she would turn her handler into confetti in a heartbeat, and unfortunately, she often did. North American, the company that designed and built the F-100, had emerged as one of the corporate winners of World War II, having given Aviation the P-51 Mustang and the B-25 Mitchell, both serving on every front and running through multiple versions, a testament to their longevity, adaptability, and the fact that they defined the standard applied to aircraft in their class. As the aviation industry contracted with the end of hostilities, there was a fight to stay relevant to the US military. In 1946, North American's order book went from 8,000 aircraft to just 24. Consequently, its headcount dropped just as dramatically, from 91,000 to 5,000 in a very short time. However, North American managed to win this fight for relevance with the legendary F-86 Sabre. This was due in equal parts to its inspired design, led by head of design Ed Schmutt, who had the sheer nerve to delay the project by a whole year to give the Sabre swept wings and tail, a concept that borrowed heavily from work done by German aeronautical engineers. Fortunately for the US, the arrival of the F-86 coincided with the escalation of tensions in Korea, which broke out into a full-blown war in 1950. The Sabre was first flown on October 10, 1947, and in Korea, it achieved an 8-to-1 kill ratio over its Soviet-designed opponent, the visually similar MiG-15. Over 8,000 ended up being produced, and going on to fly with 26 different air forces. Having gotten its Sabre into full production by 1949, the restless team at North American were reluctant to rest on their laurels, and perhaps unnerved by the abilities of the MiG, the company worked on the development of the F-86, that it hoped would be its supersonic successor. This new aircraft would be based on an F-86D Sabre, with its wings swept back from 35 degrees to 45 degrees. The angle of sweepback led to it being called the Sabre 45, and although the USAF had no immediate need for it, their ejection also contained enough encouragement for North American to keep working on the project. The question was, were Chief Engineer Ray Rice and Head of Design Ed Schmud and the North American team about to repeat their previous successes? The appearance of the MiG-15 over Korea had alarmed the USAF, and although the F-86 was able to match the MiG, its presence was enough to make the top brass want to push the Sabre 45 project forward, believing that it was only a matter of time before the Soviets rolled out an improved MiG-15. So, with official backing, the new design that was shaping up was soon given the company designation NA-180. Testing in the wind tunnel suggested that giving the wing a more radical sweep and then moving the tail would not be enough. The new design was going to need a more powerful engine, since the Sabre's General Electric J47 could only manage 5,900 pounds of thrust. It was also a plump engine that demanded a similarly plump fuselage. The NA-180 was, therefore, given the two-stage Pratt & Whitney J57, which would be the first jet engine to exceed 10,000 pounds of thrust and would soon deliver over 14,000 pounds with its afterburner. This engine would also go on to power the F-101 Voodoo, F-102 Delta Dagger, and Boeing 707, with 21,000 being built. But for Rice, Schmud, and their team, the challenge was to fit it within the airframe. This was harder than it seemed. The J57 needed a very long intake duct and a long rear end to accommodate the afterburner, which involved significant work, and it would turn out that the engine was not without flaws. Sudden demands for power, such as selecting the afterburner from low RPM, would cause a compressor stall and a disruption in the airflow through the engine, which causes a loss of thrust. The F-100 would never get over this, but that was all in the future, and the emphasis now was on getting the aircraft flying. I want to say a big thank you to everyone for taking the time to watch. It means a lot for me to share my love of aviation with like-minded people. However, I have a small favor to ask of you. If you're enjoying this video, please press the like button. This small action makes a world of difference for a small channel like mine. Now back to the story. A mock-up was duly presented to the USAF in November 1951, and they suggested over 100 changes. So the fuselage was redesigned, the bubble canopy was extended, and the designers moved the horizontal stabilizer below the wing to avoid the tendency to pitch up, which had been seen on new jets at high angles of attack. The air intake lip was made sharper, adding 9 inches to the nose with a radar antenna on the upper lip of the intake inlet covered by a flush-mounted dielectric panel. Significantly for its later career, the USAF asked for hardpoints to be added to the wing. And the aircraft received the company designation NA-192 in November 1951, and a month later, in December 1951, was for the first time designated as the F-100. The numbering was said to be fortuitous, since it was helped by various prototype designation numberings of the XF-98 Falcon and XF-99 Bomark missiles, which meant that the prototype took on the official designation YF-100A. A contract for 2 YF-100As was formally issued in January 1952, and in February 1952, the first contract for production aircraft was issued. Not only did North American make all the changes required by the USAF to the YF-100A, which would become the F-100A, but they also added a few more. For instance, the ailerons were mounted inboard to reduce wing deformation at high speed. But interestingly, the new aircraft would have no flaps, with the only lift devices being leading-edge Kruger slats, which deployed automatically at low speeds. Major Dick Garrett remembered, "Those aerodynamically retracted slats had a nasty habit of developing sticky rollers, causing one wing to have extended slats and the other to have the slat retracted. This usually happened at slow airspeeds when pulling high Gs or when flying with a high angle of attack, the Huns snap rolling in the direction of the retracted slat." It also had a large barn door-sized speed brake under the fuselage, which could be expended at speeds below 500 knots to slow the jet and improve its turn rate in combat. There were 4 T-160 20mm cannons, two on each side of the cockpit with 275 rounds each, giving the Super Sabre a much heavier punch than the Sabre. But this is not what made the Super Sabre different, or so expensive. The fuselage was made from two hollow halves of aluminium, stretch-pressed from a single sheet of metal, and the wing skins had milled stiffeners. Much of the airframe was made of titanium, and this was difficult and extremely costly to machine, needing a massive investment from North American in milling and forging. The bill alone from the presses reached $389 million by 1953, which was an astonishing figure. It meant that the Super Sabre would later be the first fighter to cost over $1 million. Despite this, the initial order was increased to 273 aircraft on August 20th, 1952. This reflects what is now known as the Cook-Craigie policy. The policy said that to get a lead over the Soviet aviation industry, the USAF and other agencies would order their aircraft straight from the drawing board, the reasoning being that the design and wind tunnel testing was now so advanced that intensive pre-production testing was unnecessary. This was a theory anyway, and it turned out to be a mistake. The Cook-Craigie policy massively underestimated the difficulty of getting complex aircraft to fly well. In addition to giving the F-100 and F-102 programs substantial hurdles to jump, it would also kill many pilots. The first YF-100A prototype, powered by a Pratt & Whitney J57P7 two-stage turbojet, flew on April 24, 1953. However, some sources have it as the 25th of May 1953 at Edwards Air Force Base in California, 7 months ahead of schedule, with Chief Engineering Test Pilot George Wheaties Welch at the controls. He took 2 beers from chase pilot Colonel Pete Everest, who would bet that the YF-100A would not go supersonic. It went effortlessly beyond Mach 1 on the first flight by engaging the afterburners, one of the first fully engineered installations on any fighter. Such was the thrust that Welch likened it to a kick from a well-fed mule. While researching this video, I found some sources stating that the prototype did not have an afterburner. Either way, George got 2 beers. Interestingly, George Welch had earned his Wheaties nickname by being the first pilot, rather than a sports star, featured on a box of Wheaties cereal, known as the Breakfast of Champions. He had earned this strange honor by being one of a few pilots to get airborne at Pearl Harbor, and had even shot as many as 4 attackers down in his P-40. Welch was ably qualified as North America's test pilot since he had contributed valuable input into the design of the F-86, was the first to fly the aircraft, and instructed combat pilots on how to use it in Korea. Reports also suggest Welch had flown the Sabre in unofficial combat missions and even shot down several MiG-15s. Although the F-100 easily exceeded Mach 1 in level flight in an F-100A, it was not the first production aircraft in military service to fly supersonically. The Soviet MiG-19 had already managed this on January 5, 1953, although the two were destined never to meet in battle. For clarity, it should be noted that while the North American F-100 Super Sabre was the world's first aircraft in military service to exceed the speed of sound in level flight, the MiG-19 received its approval for series production before its American counterpart did. While the F-100 beat the MiG-19 into service, it came at the cost of a high number of accidents due to stability problems in the early years of the American aircraft service. On the 20th of October 1953, the YF-100A made its first public appearance, the press reporting that the sonic booms from its low-level supersonic dives left onlookers gasping and children crying. However, despite the tearful children, the F-100 entered operational evaluation with the USAF from November 1953. At the time, some said it was ill-advised, too hasty, and a huge hostage to fortune. This is because it was. When the first production model flew on October 29, 1953, George Welch was again at the controls, although equally storied pilots were also involved in the program. These included Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier, and Pete Everest, who would become the fastest man alive when he took the Bell X-2 to 1,957 miles an hour, or Mach 2.9. Pilots were impressed with its performance, but there were pressing concerns about how the aircraft flew in anything other than a straight line, and even then, there were some significant question marks. Project Hot Rod was the name given to the operational suitability trials, suggesting just how the fighter was seen by those who flew it. And it shone a light on many teething problems. The trouble seemed to be with the F-100A's vertical tail, which was smaller than that of the YF-100A, which did not appear large enough to maintain adequate directional stability. There was also poor visibility over the long drooping nose during takeoff and landing, and weak longitudinal stability in high-speed flight. Even at low speeds, its handling was seen as being difficult, and there was a tendency for it to pitch up as it approached a stall, its left wing dropping alarmingly. This made landings difficult, as the Super Sabre flew along a knife edge between a safe airspeed and a fatal stall a few hundred feet from the ground. And for an aircraft that could race past Mach 1 in level flight, its climb rate was seen as disappointing, since it took 16 minutes to reach 40,000 feet. By now, the 4 T-160 cannon had given way to 4 Pontiac M39 ones with purge doors, to get rid of explosive gases in the weapons bay from firing guns. But the most significant change was that it had a shorter vertical fin with increased chord. This was purely to save weight, as the F-100 was now rapidly piling on the pounds and was done against the advice of Ed Schmood. The designer feared this would have an adverse effect on the F-100's handling. It turned out that he was right. Jack Bailey was North American's technical representative with the first fighter squadrons to fly the F-100. He remembered that one of the pilots had shown him numerous paint marks where his helmet had hit the canopy. He was unable to describe exactly what had happened, but it appeared that he had experienced the same kind of inertial coupling that would later claim the life of George Welch. And Welch was indeed the first of many pilots killed by the F-100. On October 12, 1954, he pulled 7G as he attempted to exit a dive at Mach 1.55. The stress on the airframe caused the aircraft to disintegrate. What was left of it fell to earth on Rosamond Lake in the Mojave Desert. Welch was found still strapped in his ejection seat, still alive but critically injured. However, he tragically died by the time he reached the hospital. In the month that followed, 5 more major accidents would occur. On November 8th, the Hun claimed another pilot, RAF officer Jeffrey Stephenson, who had been a prisoner of war at the infamous Colditz Castle, where he would participate in the creation of the never-flown Colditz glider. While on detachment at the USAF, flying at 13,000 feet or 4,000 meters, he joined formation with another F-100 when his aircraft dropped into a steep spiral from which he could not recover, crashing near Elgin Air Force Base. Soon after, the Hun did the same to Major Frank Emery as he practiced gunnery. His F-100A went out of control and crashed. Fortunately, Major Emery was able to eject safely, after which the entire fleet was grounded, and the production of further 108 F-100s was halted at the factory. This was the first of 2 periods of protracted grounding as F-100s experienced similarly dramatic failures. The answer to these sudden losses of control came from a 5-inch piece of film found in the wreckage of George Welch's F-100A. It showed a shadow of the fin moving across the tailplane. The aircraft had begun to yaw while still at high Mach number. The yawing motion had increased to the point where the vertical tail could no longer compensate for it and had failed, causing the whole aircraft to disintegrate. As Schmood had predicted, the fault was with the new, smaller vertical fin. Hence, the design reverted to the tail fin from the YF-100A prototype with extended wingtips and artificial feel systems for the aileron and stabilizer. The F-100A's grounding was revoked in February 1955. Still, by then, the A model was extremely unpopular with the pilots who were asked to fly it, with one pilot even asking to be entirely relieved of flying duties rather than fly the F-100. On the 31st of December 1954, the USAF decided that the final 70 F-100As would now be produced as the F-100C fighter bomber to make good the problem with the Republic F-84F Thunderstreak program. Its wingtips were also extended to improve roll characteristics and decrease stall speed. The phase-out of the A model started in 1958, leaving active duty by 1961. By then, a staggering 47 had been lost in accidents, which is a tremendous loss rate, considering only 203 had been built. And despite its high performance, it had failed for a variety of reasons as an air superiority fighter and were assigned to the Air National Guard, placed in storage, except 15 which were sent to nationalist China. However, regardless of how dangerous they were, every aircraft was needed and were being hurriedly called to frontline duty in early 1962 as the Cold War escalated. 6 F-100As were converted into reconnaissance aircraft, known as RF-100A, with their cannons replaced by 5 cameras and a noticeable bulge added to the fuselage under the cockpit to house the camera systems. These modifications, magnificently codenamed Slick Chick, were used for high-speed incursions into communist territory. During these missions, the aircraft operated in full afterburner and typically carried 4 drop tanks instead of the usual 2, thanks to adding a new pylon on each wing to accommodate the extra tanks. The Air Force later adopted the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, designated RF-101, for reconnaissance purposes, so no further F-100s underwent the Slick Chick conversions. However, the F-100C, of which 476 were produced, differed from the F-100A in several areas, primarily reflecting its new mission as a fighter bomber. The F-100C now had 6 external hardpoints with removable pylons for fuel tanks, bombs, and rockets, and could even carry the Mark 7 tactical nuclear weapons, adding up to around 5,000 pounds of stores. It was also decided that the new aircraft would dispense with fuel tanks and instead have a wet wing system, in which the wing itself was the tank. This replaced the 5 internal bladder tanks on the A model, which were not even self-sealing. Such were the concerns about weight. But this increased fuel capacity from 744 to around 1,602 gallons. A yaw damper and pitch damper were added to improve handling, and just as importantly, it now had an operated and most potent engine, the J57 P21 afterburning turbojet that was vastly more powerful, pushing out 16,950 pounds of thrust. However, the first 107 F-100Cs off the production line were fitted with the J57 P7 engine. The C model also included the addition of radio command guidance from the Bullpup missile and an in-flight refueling probe slanting up from beneath the wing to a point alongside the pilot. Buddy refueling using a hosing reel in an external pod was also possible. With the new powerful J57 engines, Colonel Horace A. Hens in an F-100C set an absolute world record of 822.09 miles an hour, and on September 4, 1955, won the Bendix Trophy when it was flown by Colonel Carlos Talbot on a 2,325-mile flight, averaging 610 miles an hour. Another record was set on the 13th of May 1957 when 3 F-100Cs flew non-stop from London to Los Angeles, with several refuelings, a distance of 6,710 miles in 14 hours and 4 minutes. The F-100C would also be the aircraft of choice for the USAF Thunderbirds aerobatic display team when transitioning from the F-84F Thunderstreak in 1955. Of more significance was that the mission profile had now changed. The F-100C was seen as a nuclear bomber responsible for tossing its weapon onto the target. This called for something known as the Low Altitude Pitch Bombing System, or LABS, with a gyroscopic sight which calculated the aiming and release information for automatic toss delivery of nuclear weapons. The plan was for the Super Sabre to approach as close to the deck as its pilot had the nerve for at around 500 knots, execute a 4G pull, out at 110 degrees, and have the aiming computer trigger the bomb release. At this point, the bomb would climb before arcing over and falling onto the target, while the F-100 continued pulling up until inverted, rolled upright, and dived away to avoid the blast. But the new aircraft was still not trouble-free. There were problems with its electrical system, landing gear, brake parachutes, and probes that tended to snap off during maneuvers while refueling. And despite improvements to its handling, it was an F-100C collected from North American's Palmdale factory in California on January 10, 1956, that made its flight characteristics famous and gave the most extreme of them a name, the Sabre Dance. On the 10th of January 1956, First Lieutenant Barty Ray Brooks and 2 other pilots picked up 3 brand new F-100C Super Sabre fighters from the North American Aviation plant in Palmdale, California, to fly them to the nearby George Air Force Base, only 42 miles away. The brief flight was uneventful until they came to lowering the landing gear. One of the other pilots saw that the scissors link joining the upper and lower sections of the nose gear strut on Brooks's Super Sabre was loose. Concerned that he would not be able to steer the fighter after touching down, Brooks diverted to Edward Air Force Base, 36 miles away, where a longer runway and more emergency equipment were available. The aircraft was flying at the high approach speeds necessary when an aircraft has a 45-degree wing, no trailing edge flaps, and a tendency to stall easily and quickly at low altitude. This was all before the advent of ejector seats, which could catapult the pilot to safety from 0 feet at 0 speed. This was clearly a deadly set of circumstances. Brooks sensed that his approach would see him land short of the foam with which the fire crews had carpeted the runway. He pushed the throttle forward, but was fatally late in feeding in more power to an aircraft that, in any case, would not respond quickly. As his airspeed fell, the wingtips stalled, and the aircraft was rocked by adverse yaw, with its nose swaying left and right as Brooks tried to use his ailerons to stop the rolling. The airspeed dropped further, the yaw worsened, and the nose pitched higher as its center of lift moved forward. Brooks hit the afterburner. The sudden power and the already nose-high attitude pitched the nose up even further, bringing the F-100 almost vertical. Brooks twice tried to lower his nose to reduce the angle of attack and fly out of his predicament, but the nose pitched up again and the aircraft swayed down the runway, blasting gravel into the air. It finally rolled right, steadied for a moment, and rolled over even further, crashing on its side in a ball of flames. The pilot was found still strapped to his ejector seat, which had been hurled clear of the wreckage, with his helmet and oxygen mask torn off.
Our squadron was shown film clips of his crash, and it was obvious what mistakes he made,
said Curtis Burns, a pilot who knew Brooks.
I have seen several pilots die in fiery crashes when they made mistakes in handling the F-100.
Brooks's legacy was film footage that were used to train other pilots, and a verse in a song that F-100 pilots sang. Don't give me a 100 to fight against friendly or foe. That old saber dance made me crap in my pants. Don't give me a 100. John Wilson, a fellow Super Sabre pilot who had flown with Brooks, had a unique perspective on the crash. The footage made its way into several mass-market films, moving him to say,
I have big problems when I've seen it in the commercial movies. I'd planned to go back to New York for the Christmas holidays when Bart heard that my leave had been cancelled and that I'd been assigned to fly that mission. He stepped up and said,
I've been home recently. You go on leave and I'll take the flight for you.
So as you can see, I'm somewhat emotional about the accident. I loved the guy. He did me a big favor and it killed him.
The last F-100C was produced in July 1956, giving way to the F-100D, which was considered to be the most definitive single-seat version. The F-100D took development even more strongly in the direction of ground attack, though it did nothing to harm air combat capability. The F-100D was equipped with advanced mission avionics, a sophisticated autopilot, and the latest labs for tossing those nukes. Other changes included a redesigned wing with 2-piece outer ailerons to address the many flight problems inherent in the previous F-100 versions. So, North American finally gave the F-100D broad-slotted flaps. These helped reduce landing speeds and making the aircraft more controllable, which were considered hot landing aircraft since they did not have landing flaps, with pilots having to come in fast, relying on the parachute and wheel brakes to slow them down. The D was also given a crank, winged, and increased its area to around 400 square feet. There was an even larger vertical fin, and the rudder now had a trailing edge which carried a rearward warning radar. The F-100D was still powered with a single 16,000-pound thrust Pratt & Whitney J57 P21 afterburning turbojet engine, giving it a top speed of 910 miles an hour, slightly slower than the F-100C's max speed of 925 miles an hour. Production finally ended entirely at the company's Inglewood plant in August 1959, and that is where its story might have ended, as the fighter that had 95 major accidents and 6 fatalities in 100,000 flight hours, giving it a historically poor safety record, at least until the F-104 obligingly came along. What changed it was Vietnam. American involvement in the country had been escalating steadily from a point where it was providing military advisors to where it was now sending combat troops. So while F-100Ds were based in the Philippines, they were soon sent to Thailand, a deployment taken more seriously after the Pathet Lao forces brought down a Douglas SC-47B while it monitored radar transmissions from Laos. And it was in August 1964 that they moved to Da Nang in South Vietnam.
"We never thought we'd be doing air-to-ground in a stinking Southeast Asian backwater,"
said Colonel Charles Vasiliadis.
"We never thought our silver bullet of a fighter would eventually be painted the green-brown color of a Vietnamese swamp."
Their first combat mission suggested that the USAF might have done better to leave the aircraft stateside. 8 F-100Ds led by Colonel George Lavin were sent to destroy an anti-aircraft site that had downed an RF-8A and a VF-111 F-8D, but the target area was poorly mapped and beyond the reach of radar coverage and navigation aids. The only available intelligence was that it looked like a small fortress. The second flight was separated from Colonel Lavin's flight and bombed a target 25 miles away, while Lavin himself caused only minor damage before he found that he was running short of fuel. He burst a tire on landing and disabled the landing lights on the airfield, meaning that his wingman, First Lieutenant Lloyd Huchin, had to land in complete darkness. Lavin said this mission was one of the worst I have ever flown, and was relieved of his command, and Huchin described it as a complete fiasco which was poorly planned and poorly executed. Lavin, however, added a bitter postscript, taking a swipe at political interference from Washington led by President Lyndon Johnson, better known as LBJ, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, saying, "I felt that my squadron commander was LBJ and my operations officer was McNamara. The one high spot was a possible victory over a MiG-17 above the Gulf of Tonkin when Captain Donald Kilgus fired on the retreating aircraft. His squadron mates said this was a victory, but the USAF said otherwise and only credited him with a probable." One of the things that made operations against the North Vietnamese MiGs difficult was the compressor stall problems, which became manifest when the afterburner was selected in high angle of attack maneuvers in aerial combat. Even without the stall, it had nothing like the quick acceleration of the MiG-17, which was only half as heavy as an F-100.
"I feel confident that the F-100 would not have fared well against MiGs, because I do not believe that it could either outturn or outclimb the MiG-17 or MiG-21, or outdive or outrun the latter fighter,"
said Lieutenant Colonel David Williams. The F-100 suffered from a low thrust-to-weight ratio, and in a hard turn, the aircraft would shudder, approaching a stall even with the leading-edge slats extended. The airspeed would then bleed off quickly, leaving the pilot in a terribly vulnerable position.
"I once experienced a compressor stall so violent that fire exited both the nose intake and tailpipe simultaneously, as verified by my wingman. It shook the rudder pedals so hard that I temporarily lost my foot contact with them. Such an event in air-to-air combat could spoil a pilot's day if he was, for instance, attempting to break in a hostile attacker."
Despite carrying the first AIM-9B Sidewinders and bullpup-guided missiles, the Super Sabre was no longer seen as having air-to-air mission, and a sense that it would not survive an encounter with MiGs, despite Captain Kilgus's alleged victory, suggested that this was a wise decision. It meant that the Super Sabre was now only to be used in the close air support role. Just how close is suggested by the fact that over 180 Super Sabres were lost to ground fire over the next 8 years, because while it was not going head-to-head with MiGs, the enemy artillery was taking an increasing toll on the aircraft. 3 were lost in quick succession in early 1965, whilst trying to suppress the same guns that brought them down. And that is why one pass haul ass started to appear in briefing notes for missions. The base at Phan Rang, between the mountains and the coast, was near enough to the enemy to be under occasional mortar and rocket fire. F-100s flying from the base at Bien Hoa were even attacked by satchel bombers and shot at by enemy snipers hiding close to the runway. One pilot was hit on final approach and ejected just a mile from the runway, but still had to be rescued quickly before enemy troops got to him. It was the same at Phu Cat, where pilots found themselves attacking positions just 5 miles away. In tackling these targets, the F-100 pilots now earned themselves a reputation for almost uncanny accuracy, albeit maintained at huge personal risk, as can be seen when they were asked to tackle a Viet Cong formation who were attacking a special forces camp at Bù Đốc, 100 miles north of Saigon. We were awakened at about 0200 hours by the scramble phone and ran out to our jets, Captain Norman Turner remembered. As soon as we got airborne, I could see a flare light to the north. It was a clear night, and I thought it would be a fun mission. I was wrong about that part. We climbed to about 20,000 feet, and I contacted the forward air controller. He said the camp was in danger of being overrun. I felt an urgent need to get down there and help. I'd only been in country 3 weeks and wanted to prove myself. I knew that bombs were useless, so I set up the rocket pods hot for the pickle button and the guns hot for the trigger. I turned on the bomb sight but left it mechanically caged. I flew out to the west until I was over dark ground, indicating that there was no cloud deck there, and started to descend. It was a dark night as the moon was in the last quarter, but flares lit the cloud deck, making a sort of surrealistic indefinite horizon. I could not see how high I was above the ground, but descended as low as I dared, using the clouds ahead as a poor reference. When I came to the cloud deck, I was instantly on instrument flight rules. Pulling up through the clouds, I made a 360-degree turn and decided to get lower. I distinctly remember thinking, tonight I'll probably die, but I was more afraid of failing to help the guys on the ground. I flew towards the deck again. I thought I might hit trees at any moment, and remember lifting my butt up from the seat in a silly attempt to avoid contact. This time, I found myself below the cloud deck and over a black void. Then I saw the camp below me. I was only a few hundred feet high and could see a burning building just outside the perimeter. There was smoke and haze everywhere, and visibility was poor at less than a mile. The little runway was clear, and I could see a tree line on the opposite side from the camp. I assumed this was the target area. Then, out of the haze, the camp appeared directly under my nose, dead ahead. Without really thinking about it, I instantly rolled into a 90-degree turn and let the nose fall to about a 1-degree dive angle, aiming at the left end of the scrub line. There aren't bomb sight settings for that sort of delivery, so I guessed. I pushed the bomb button twice at a range of about 3,000 feet. The left rocket pod fired first, immediately followed by the right. I was blinded for about half a second, then I put the pipper on the tree line in a 90-degree bank and held the trigger down. I walked the 20mm high explosive incendiary along the line until I felt that I was about to hit the ground, then snapped the wings level and pulled up, probably inside 1,000-foot range. I was through the cloud deck and into the night sky almost instantly. The forward air controller told me that all 8 machine gun positions had stopped firing. I want to extend a big thank you to Jared, who runs the channel Jet Jared, for allowing me to use his incredible footage of the Collins Foundation F-100F, operated in partnership with the Vietnam War Flight Museum. Be sure to check out and subscribe to his channel. There's a link in the description. Their team is doing amazing work to keep this historic aircraft airworthy, honoring the crews who operated the F-100 and preserving their legacy. Forward Air Control, or FAC, would now become central to the lives of the F-100 crews. Delivered by pilots, usually qualified on fighters, flying Cessna Bird Dogs or Cessna Skymasters, or even slogging through the jungle with the soldiers on the ground, it was invaluable to the effectiveness of ground attack sorties. The controller was tasked with managing the attack while keeping a light aircraft that was slow, thin-skinned, and underpowered close enough to the heavily armed enemy soldiers on the ground. In time, it took about 10 and sometimes less than 5 minutes from first contact with the enemy for the first bombs to fall from the F-100, and they became so accurate that they were often used instead of artillery. Usually, some of our grunts were calling for close air support because they were taking fire, so the task was to get a good idea on the bad guy's position, separate the good from the bad, and roll in with your shake and bake, said Major Dick Garrett, referring to the mix of bombs and napalm carried under each wing, with as many passes as fuel and ordnance would support. I've seen times when a helicopter forward air controller would fly right over the enemy positions, getting the shit shot out of himself, just to drop a smoke grenade on enemy craniums so that we could have a good mark. I'd use every drop of gas I had to stay on station as long as I could in order to help these guys out, then divert to the nearest USAF field. Such an opportunity didn't present itself often, but when it did, you knew that your aeroplane ticket over to Nam had just paid for itself. The missions were often lethal to the pilots, who found that if the anti-aircraft fire did not shoot them down, the blast of their own munitions could be just as deadly. They were often flying so low that even trees were considered a hazard. Given that the F-100 did not accelerate quickly and could experience compressor stall at certain angles if the throttle was advanced too fast, and by the time its pilot realized he had made a mistake, just like on landing, it was often too late and too low to recover. While the F-100 pilots were being lost in increasing numbers, so were the forward air controllers. Nearly 500 Cessna OV-1 Bird Dog aircraft were lost to all causes, along with nearly 200 O-2 Skymasters and 64 OV-10 Broncos, which suggested that forward air control was not for the faint-hearted. This made the USAF look at the fast FAC method, using the two-seat F-100F developed as the final variant in 1957 and almost as an afterthought, previously intended to train new pilots. Major Bud Day was appointed commander of the fast FAC 100s and gave him the call sign Misty after he remembered hearing Johnny Mathis sing a song of the same name in Las Vegas in 1958. On Misty sorties, the F-100F would mark its target with smoke rockets and allow Phantoms and Thunder Chiefs to finish them off. The advantage was that they could be over the target much faster and stay longer, thanks to in-flight refueling. Around 5 hours was thought to be the loiter time. But the job proved itself to be almost as risky to the F-100 crews as the Cessna crews. The losses of Bud Day's unit were 4 times as great as for any other Super Sabre unit, causing the USAF to scour other units for flyable airframes. If bounced by MiG-21s, which was unlikely south of the DMZ, to which the F-100s had been confined but always possible, their pilots were briefed to dive to ground level and go supersonic, which the MiGs could not do at low altitude. The F-100Fs got shot down a lot while flying Misty, remembered Captain Joe Vincent. I don't remember them getting in any trouble getting volunteers, added Colonel Bob Wendrock, who would go on to fly 289 combat missions in the F-100. Fighter pilots, in general, are of a mindset that they want to fly the most demanding missions, and Misty missions were perceived to be the most demanding. The crewman in the rear seat, usually an F-100D pilot himself, would be expected to guide the pilot to the target using composite maps that were a mosaic of conventional maps and photographs, and then photograph them themselves. By the time the F-100 started to be phased out, 34 pilots had been shot down, 2 of them twice, 7 were killed, and 3 were taken prisoner. There was one more way that the F-100 was used in Vietnam, and it was again using the F-100F, this time in the Wild Weasel role. As unappealing as the Misty missions, Wild Weasel was simply insane. This involved using the aircraft as a decoy for batteries of SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, which had begun to spring up around critical points all over the north. These missiles were a recent arrival in Vietnam, having made themselves famous by shooting down Gary Powers' U-2 over the Soviet Union in 1960. The principal weakness of the SA-2 was that it was radar-guided, so if the radars were destroyed, the missiles were useless. The North Vietnamese would team them with anti-aircraft artillery, regularly moving them to avoid detection, but when the Fan Song radar locked on, it would reveal itself to the attackers, giving away its position. The commander of the Operational Test Flight Group, Lieutenant Colonel James Krontnik, was removed for openly querying the wisdom of flying as a decoy for supersonic SAMs. When Captain Jack Donovan, an electronic warfare officer from a B-52, was asked to fly on the Wild Weasel sorties, he replied, "You want me to ride in the back seat of a 2-seat fighter with a teenage killer in the front seat? You've got to be shitting me." Soon enough, YGBSM, an abbreviation of "You've got to be shitting me," became the unofficial motto of the unit. Despite opposition, the USAF persisted. The F-100Fs duly began to fly missions on December 1st, 1965. It is worth remembering that while Wild Weasel missions were later flown by Thunder Chief and Phantom aircraft equipped with jamming pods, the F-100F had no space left under its wings to carry them into action, and was very exposed. While they still had cannon and rocket pods for protection against ground units, those stores were wholly useless against a missile streaking towards them at Mach 3.5. The Super Sabre pilots evolved tactics to throw off the SA-2, using a diving turn into the flight path of the missile and a high G brake seconds before impact. They could and did attack the launch sites, but it was later up to more advanced Thunder Chiefs and Phantoms to land the fatal blow. In the first mission, Captains John Pitchford and Bob Trier flew ahead of a section of 8 Thunder Chief aircraft, approaching their target over heavy clouds. A gun battery raked the F-100F, causing Pitchford and Trier to eject from the burning jet near the coast. Pitchford ejected and was shot 3 times and captured, spending 2,612 days in captivity. Trier was not so lucky, and was killed while exchanging fire with North Vietnamese troops on the ground. Robert D. Trier is buried at the Arlington National Cemetery and is honored on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In time, the AGM-45 Shrike missile was introduced. This was an anti-radiation missile that could home in on the radar used by SAM operators, and while it had a 10-mile radius, its warhead would generally only take out the radar and leave the launcher intact. The mission profile exposed a significant weakness of the Super Sabre that no flying skill could make good. The accompanying Thunder Chiefs were 100 miles an hour faster, and the only way that the Super Sabres could keep up was to use their afterburners, overtaxing already aging engines while burning through an alarming amount of fuel. While only 3 F-100Fs were lost over the 8-month use of the aircraft in the Wild Weasel missions compared to the staggering death toll of the Misty missions, it was clear that the performance of the Super Sabre belonged to an earlier age. Simply put, what had once been a hot rod was now too slow and ill-matched to its task. The last combat-capable aircraft left Vietnam in 1971, with the type having flown 360,283 combat sorties, more that were flown by all the P-51 Mustangs in the Second World War. It had also been an expensive exercise in finding a Cold War interceptor a new role. There had been over 40 lost to accidents, 7 to Viet Cong assaults on its bases, and a staggering 186 due to enemy action. The US Air Force wanted something in Europe as a deterrent beyond their conventional nuclear-armed F-100Ds, as they feared most of these aircraft could be destroyed in moments by short-range Soviet tactical nuclear weapons. To address this, they experimented with adding a zero-length, or ZEL, launch capability to several of its fighter designs, including the Republic F-84 and F-100D, something that the Germans had experimented with during the war, and something which the German Air Force continued to test with the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. Sometimes you can't let a good idea go. The idea was quite simple. Rather than launch a fighter aircraft from a conventional hard-surface runway, strap a huge rocket to the fuselage and fire straight into the air like a giant firework. The advantage of this method is that it keeps the aircraft mobile and difficult to locate. The relative simplicity of placing a massive rocket beneath a fighter attached to a launch platform that could be placed anywhere was naturally of keen interest to Air Force brass. Zero-length launching capabilities could easily be added to the F-100D by modifying the fuselage and attaching a rocket-dyne booster manufactured for the Snark missile, capable of 132,000 pounds of thrust. They could launch an F-100D weighing up to 37,000 pounds directly into flight. An F-100D could be prepped for launch in less than 10 minutes. During this time, the pilot enters the cockpit and starts the engine. The jet is raised into the nose-high attitude launch position, where, when ready, the rocket booster ignites, and the F-100D is fired into the air like a dart. Once the rocket fuel is expended, the booster and frame attachment is released, and the F-100D continues on its mission under its own power. However, sometimes the rocket failed to detach correctly, damaging the aircraft. The first successful ZEL launch of an F-100D was on the 7th of July 1957, piloted by North American test pilot Al Blackburn. Although the ZEL system was considered feasible, it was dropped by the late 50s, with the last F-100D ZEL launch in 1959. Just 2 years after arriving home, it was withdrawn from frontline service entirely and relegated to National Guard units who flew it until 1980. It did, however, experience a lengthy retirement courtesy of US diplomacy, which rewarded its allies with airframes that were then used in a variety of post-colonial squabbles. The delivery to the Taiwanese started in 1958 after China bombed the Taiwanese island of Kinmen just off the Chinese coast, and received more ex-National Guard examples in the early 70s. They were used to fly intelligence-gathering missions over China, where several were lost. Reports are that it was involved in various skirmishes with the People's Liberation Army Air Force, but these are impossible to verify. Turkey received mainly ex-USAF aircraft from the late 50s onwards, with others given to them by the Danes much later. Like the Taiwanese, they were also used in anger, this time against the Greeks in Cyprus. During the Battle of Tileria, or Kokina, depending on your allegiance, in 1964, they became briefly infamous for dropping napalm on a hospital. When Turkey invaded the island in 1974, there was a belated echo of the American experience in Vietnam, when a number were lost to Greek ground fire, and they accidentally sank one of their own destroyers, the Kosatepe, with the loss of 80 sailors. Super Sabres were also given to the French, who would display an altogether more troubled relationship with America. They first arrived on May 1, 1958, and were based in Germany, but were also used to fly combat missions from France against separatists in the soon-to-be ex-French colony of Algeria. France might have been unceremoniously kicked out of Algeria, but it left NATO of its own accord in 1967, asking their former allies, the Americans, to leave French soil. The French were asked to leave Germany in return, so the F-100s duly returned home, where they stayed until replaced by the Jaguar in the late 70s. They seem to have been flown to Great Britain, where they were stored. Some found their way to various museums and some were scrapped. Finally, the Danes proved to be more reliable and less troublesome recipient of the aircraft. The first examples arrived in July 1959 to replace the Republic F-84G fighter bombers and do everything from close air support to air defense and maritime attack. The F-84G had its faults, but its maximum speed was just over 600 miles an hour, and it generally potted along at just under 500. This tended to allow time for mistakes to be corrected before they became accidents, with the supersonic-capable, afterburner-equipped F-100 did not. This might explain why a third of Danish Super Sabres were lost in accidents, and why the Danes, who tended to observe the maxim "train hard, fight easy," and who pushed their aircraft to the limit, twice had to ground them. It was a very stable platform at low level, and performed the fighter bomber role very well, remember General Christian Hvid. It was rather easy to handle and a very nice aircraft for formation flying. However, it was unforgiving if you failed to pay attention to its idiosyncrasies. The main challenge was adverse yaw at a high angle of attack, hard maneuvering, or tight final turns. This aircraft needed a fair amount of rudder during these maneuvers, and unfortunately, quite a few pilots lost control, and some also lost their lives when not following the correct handling procedures. The F-100 did not have a good safety record in Royal Danish Air Force service. The main reason being the challenge of flying low-level fighter bomber attack missions in Northern Europe, and handling the peculiarities mentioned, as well as a period of engine failures, which is obviously a terrible problem with a single-engine aircraft. All of the survivors had stopped flying as combat aircraft in the mid-80s, replaced by the more capable, predictable, and ultimately safer machines. However, the F-100 was a fine example of what results when new technology pushed the boundaries of knowledge in an era where instinct was still seen as a virtue. As the Americans had found as early with the F-100A and again in Vietnam, its engine made the F-100, as one pilot said, underpowered or overloaded, take your pick, but Colonel Robert Wendrock gave it a more affectionate tribute. It was a fighter pilot's airplane that separated the ham-fisted from the really good sticks, he said. It was fairly easy to fly, but could bite you in the rear in a heartbeat if you didn't respect it. The jet constantly talked to you, letting you know by feel when it was close to becoming scary. The really high-time F-100 guys could make it do things that would amaze most of us. It was very safe as long as you respected it. As the decades wore on, the F-100 found itself pushed into belated combat service, whether it was over Algeria, China, or Cyprus, and many were converted to pilotless target drones to be shot down ingloriously by their own side. Even though the aluminium finish was inevitably covered in dull camouflage paint, the afterburner always had the last word, scorching off the drab colors, leaving burned, bare metal titanium behind. Perhaps the aircraft was trying to return to its late 50s glory days when the bare aluminium was covered with shining silver lacquer. The world seemed simpler and easier to understand. Back when Wheaties Welch was easing it smoothly through the sound barrier in level flight, way before Barty Brooks discovered the saber darts, when there was still nothing but progress ahead, the skies were brilliant and vaulting blue. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and consider subscribing to more aviation videos like this one on the Gloucester Javelin or here on the Blackburn Buccaneer.